Lee. I'm a Senior Special Assistant to Academic Affairs here at the Kent State Ashtabula campus. Dean Stocker sends her apologies that she cannot be here this morning, but she's not feeling well, and at 6 a.m. said, I just can't do this today. So any of you who know Dean Stocker know that that does not happen very often. So I'm glad to be here with all of you this morning. And I'm privileged to introduce to you Valerie Kelly, who is the Executive Director of Kent State Online. She leads a team of instructional designers and educational technologists who assist faculty in the development of online courses for the Kent State system. She is also an adjunct instructor in the User Experience Design degree program at Kent State University. She holds a Master's of Science in Information Architecture and Knowledge Management and a Master's of Art in Journalism and Mass Communications. That's quite a resume. She has spent the last decade working in higher education in multimedia development and instructional design. Prior to that, she worked in industry as a software help system designer, technical writer, and also as a web developer. So please join me in welcoming Val to the Kent State Ashtabula campus.
Okay, I'll try out this mic. Is that pretty good? Does that sound good? Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate coming up here. We actually came up last night and enjoyed a nice bed and breakfast here in Ashtabula and had a wonderful time, walked around, enjoyed a nice dinner. I guess you always have sunshine up here, which is great. So I'm Val Kelly, as you well know now, and I really appreciate being brought in to talk about the idea of future, the idea of change and how we manage it. That's kind of my whole world. And so the distance learning perspective, or somewhere between Panacea and Pain, really fits because my perspective, I used to live in Silicon Valley. I have a lot of connection through family and friends and personal experience with startups and that kind of thing. And when I first started in higher ed, I started with multimedia. And I love it, right? So I see the potential of distance learning or online learning, the internet, just connecting us to the world. It's fantastic, right? I get really excited, passionate about this. But I also work in an area where it's painful. All this change, it's not an easy thing. It's not always, nothing goes quite the way you expect it to go. And whenever there's change, something gets lost, right? So we have to be careful to make sure that we know what we're trying to do, what our goals are, and how we get there and who may be affected along the way. But I did want to give you, my perspective tends to be pretty optimistic. And I'm going to play a video. Whoops, I have to go over here to do that. That it gives kind of a summary of what's going on at Kent State with online learning. Everybody, the students and faculty are talking about their courses, and they give you examples. You'll see little clips that come out of some of our online courses. And why that is, it's about 4 minutes, and hopefully it'll give you, kind of give us on the same page as how we think about online at Kent State.
I think with online classes, I've been able to interact with my professors and my classmates. I've been able to network with them, and upon graduation, I think I'm set up just as well as somebody who would take classes in person.
I think one of the concerns that people have about online learning is that they feel that the students will not get the same experience as they have when they have connectedness in the classroom with their teacher and direct interaction with other students. But if you design an online class carefully and intelligently, you can make sure that the students have a very high quality experience. For example, for my chemistry in our world course, in addition to all the teaching materials, I also produced a series of demo videos which actually has been doing experiments for the students and explaining what their purpose is. And this helps to introduce a live feel into the classroom. Those particular videos on KS YouTube have got thousands and thousands of hits, so the students have obviously been watching them and they obviously like them. So, in the chemistry in our world course, We study the chemistry that is behind these cool things. We recognize that chemistry is the cool behind everything in the world around us.
The User Experience Design Program is an online program that prepares students to assume roles in the world of design of websites, mobile applications that are effective, efficient, and enjoyable to use.
So online learning at Kent State is effective and unique because we not only put up the content and make sure that it's quality content, but we also afford students the opportunity to interact with their instructors real time, with each other in real time, and we've built in ways for them to interact with industry leaders and hiring managers.
Welcome to today's program. I'm Sonia Dittman, host of The Way We Were, where we use today's technology to visit with yesterday's people. And today we have a very special guest, the great Greek astronomer Claudius Ptolemaeus, or Ptolemy. So Ptolemy, what was it like living with all those famous old Greek guys? You know, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato.
Those guys you mentioned lived a long time before me, Sonia. About as long before me as Shakespeare was before you.
Overall, it's a great positive experience. I've had a great time learning. The classes were great on schedule, I work full time. So it just fits in really well. I can work when I want, and I do have a library in terms of lifetime to work. But overall, it's very positive. It works really well with my life.
I love learning online.
Okay, so that's gives you an idea of some of the things that are in our online courses, how it's perceived by students, how it's perceived by faculty. My team works primarily with graduate programs, fully online programs where we redesign the entire program for online, and user experience design was one of our first programs that we put out that, again, had really great national reach. So it went from maybe 40 students to nearly 200 students in just over a year. We have about 6 of those programs that we work with very closely, but we also do a lot of undergraduate. And you can see Kent State, we're a working class university. A lot of our students work, so the convenience and the timing of online classes, I can't even keep up with it. We had a goal of about 30% of students taking one online class. Made this video, took a while to finish it. It's at 40%. Last spring, it was actually 50% of students took one online class. So that's really popular with our undergraduate population to take 1 or 2 classes to make their schedule more flexible. But when I was invited to talk here, I looked through the series. I talked to Dean Stocker, and she mentioned, the challenges that you're having in Ashtabula County that we have across the country, but also the idea that you're looking toward the future, and your community leaders that will be at this breakfast that are thinking about planning and change. And so I thought, well, it's a great opportunity to talk about disruptive innovation and looking to the future. Clayton Christensen, it's in gray at the bottom there, had a book called wow, just slipped my mind. The Innovation Dilemma. So he has this disruptive innovation theory that he actually came up with when he was doing his PhD thesis. Has anybody heard of that before, the disruptive innovation in Clayton Christensen? So he has this quote. He was actually addressing a conference on higher education. And he had this quote, "Look through the lens of theory into the future. You can actually see the future very clearly." Some people may dispute that. He's actually been somewhat controversial because some of his predictions didn't come true. But his theory has held up really well. And the theory of disruptive innovation is the idea, what he looked at was, why did companies like Kodak and Xerox and IBM, why weren't they at the cusp when there were these new innovations coming out? Why did they kind of miss out? Why were they slow to react? And his theory basically states that they didn't make a mistake. They didn't not react because they weren't well-run companies. They were actually exceptionally well-run companies. But what happens is, in a well-run company, what are you doing? You're serving your current client base. And when you do that, you're actually producing a product. And the idea is to keep producing that product. And maybe you do sustained innovation. So just a little bit better over time. And each year, you kind of convince people that you maybe want the newer model of what you just had and spend a little bit more money and buy it. But in fact, it wasn't because they were terribly run companies. It's because they were well-run companies. They didn't see this disruptive innovation on the periphery. And disruptive innovations usually start off as incredibly terrible products. It's a new idea, a new invention, but what they do is they don't work very well at the beginning, but they serve a certain population. So it's usually a population of people that aren't being served. And that population adopts this technology. And over time, this technology keeps getting better and better, and it gets better fast. And that's when well-run companies kind of miss out. And he gives lots of examples. The steel industry was the main thing one of the main companies he studied. And it works, it held up quite well. Apple and Intel brought him in to do consulting. He's pretty well known in growth areas like that. But this chart actually shows you for online and distance learning. What happened to us is that we're a public university. We are a very traditional organization, which is a very good thing. And we also, kind of have our mission. We do things very similarly to how we've done it in the past. Distance learning was hard for us. Now, Kent State itself actually started distance learning well over 15 years ago. We actually had an online program almost 15 years ago. Compared to a lot of public universities, we were actually fairly progressive in adopting distance learning, online learning. The regional campuses played a big part in that because we communicated back and forth, and we already had kind of that thinking going on that we wanted to serve populations that couldn't just come to one campus someplace. So in a lot of ways, Kent, we actually are a leader for public universities of how many online programs and courses we have, how many students we have taking courses. But you can see what happens is, down here, this line right here, this is public universities or not-for-profit universities. And that's that same line that Clayton Christensen would have drawn for companies with their sustaining innovations. Over time, you're just growing a little bit, kind of doing the same thing. This line are the for-profits. The University of Phoenix, the Capellas, the Kaplans, they saw a huge need for people that maybe couldn't even get into public universities, or didn't have access. They actually, we think of them as cheaper. They actually tend to be fairly expensive degrees, but a certain portion of the population wasn't being served by us. And you can see what happens. The growth was extreme over 10 years. So now 2010, and that's about right. All the public universities kind of woke up and said, wow, what are we missing out on? And more than that, as we started to offer online courses, it was actually just demand that drove it. Those courses filled up, those classes filled up, and we started creating more courses. And so, but then we really started thinking about this too, of the idea of what does that mean? How are we going about this strategically? Are we giving students the same quality education? That chart, initial online education, distance learning. Well, distance learning has been around forever. Correspondence courses have been around for a very, very long time, and that's the beginning of distance learning. Distance learning now, online courses, cannot be correspondence courses. Actually, it's a law. The Department of Education looks at your courses. They really get scrutinized. They have to be interactive. You have to be interacting with your professor and with other students. There has to be clear indication of activity and so forth. So online courses now are very different than those original correspondence type courses. Sometimes we don't know that because we talk about online courses as if they're one static thing. They're very different. There's a lot of variety and that type of thing. But again, since I'm talking to community leaders, I thought this was a really great chance to kind of bring together the idea of the change we deal with in distance learning, but also just change overall and change in community. And I recently watched this movie called Urbanized by Gary Hustwit. And so I think it makes just a wonderful metaphor for distance learning. It's actually a documentary. And Gary Hustwit, he does, if you want to look him up, it's on Netflix, I think. He does these amazing documentaries. He actually did a documentary about Helvetica, which was about a font, an actual typeset. So anybody who can make a documentary out of a font actually can make pretty much anything interesting. But what he did in this Urbanized, he was talking to architects, he was looking at city planning. And again, you have the same kind of dynamic where, you know, the world is growing, there's interconnectedness, but growth often results in this, right, in change, because if it's not planned, it still happens, right? And so if you're not strategic about it, things can get out of control. So he really was talking about the same ideas of the potential, the panacea, and the pain of growth in urban areas. But then he started talking about, he looked at all these different examples of cities around the world, and how do they succeed, or where they didn't succeed. And so he talked about different drivers, he identified several different drivers of change. And we deal with this a lot in distance learning. So technology-driven change, a lot of what happens in the distance learning world, I'm looking at Shelley Marshall here, she knows all about this, is that a new technology comes and we all jump like, oh my gosh, we got to do this now, you know. So sometimes we forget we're teachers and educators, and the pedagogy, the teaching and learning, the theories, the things we understand, sometimes we put that aside because, whoa, there's a new technology and we have to try this out. So we have to be really careful about just letting technology drive our decisions. Technology is great, and the improvements that can come with technology, but it has to be planful. It really has to be thought through carefully. This idea of Brasilia, Brazil, I think is really interesting because it's a city just created in the 1950s to be the capital of Brazil. And during that time, 1950s, what was the big innovation? What did everybody love about that era? Everybody loved their automobile, right? We were all keen on driving and getting our highways in. This entire city was planned around the automobile. It has beautiful wide boulevards. Buildings are spaced apart. There's plenty of parking, all kinds of things like that. And what happened is they forgot what makes a city, which is community. And when the buildings are too far apart, they ended up not having this community. They ended up really struggling with that. And it's been a problem for that city since. And we saw the same thing happen all across the United States. Akron has a freeway going right through the middle of it, right? So we did that thinking, well, we just make it more convenient with this technology that we're in love with. But we also caused a lot of problems and maybe didn't stop to think, well, what is the essence of what we're trying to do? Who are we? What are our needs, really? The other thing about technology-driven change that we sometimes have to think about and often think about in distance learning too is we sometimes use the very thing that's causing the problem to try to fix it. So for instance, when we're in a busy city and the freeway's clogged, I can't get to where I want, there's no parking, there's smog, you know, so I'm frustrated. What do I ask for? I ask for more roads, I ask for more parking lots. And what has happened, originally that's what we kept doing in cities, but more and more you start to see cities undoing that and actually pulling out some of those things and making more bike lanes, making it more pedestrian friendly, moving back toward the community idea of actually having those enclaves of community that are so important in cities. So again, we have to think about that when we're changing things. But this is something that is very important in higher ed. Avoidance-driven change. Just because you avoid change doesn't mean change isn't coming. And so a lot of times we'll just say, well, it's not going to happen, and I don't care for that, so we just won't do it. It still happens. So that's what happened with distance learning. It came, right? And students asked for it, and that's what they're looking at. Obviously, we have a lot of examples around here of where that happened. And I love this story. This is authoritarian-driven change. And again, it's something that we have to be really concerned about as administrators and as leaders. A lot of times you just want to say, hey, here's a great idea. I'm going to plan this whole thing out. You know, I'm going to have a core group of people. We're going to plan the whole thing out, and it's going to be beautiful. Everybody will love it. In this case, it's Stuttgart 21 was a project in Stuttgart, Germany. And it truly was. I mean, I looked at, they show all the pictures. The idea was to have this centralized train station in Stuttgart, all these connecting routes. So it would kind of make Stuttgart more progressive in Germany, be able to bring people in and out and so forth. And it was beautiful, beautiful design. So they started this project. They started the initiation of it. They really didn't have community buy-in. And there was one essential flaw in the whole plan. Where they were putting the station was in this beautiful park, and the park contained beautiful oak trees that were one of the few things that had survived the bombing of World War II. So these were very important to that community, essential to the community in some ways. So they started this project. There are protests. They continue on with the project. School kids get hosed and injured, and anyway, so they call off the project. But first, they've already destroyed the oaks. The project gets halted. The whole thing's a disaster, right? And it's just an unfortunate thing of there just really wasn't communication. There just really wasn't the community involvement in something like that. And it probably wasn't a terrible idea. Just part of it was terrible. But then he gets onto the idea of idea-driven change. And this is where we really have to acknowledge that we're all part of this. We have to collaborate. We have to think together how we can make the future better. And in this case, he gives several examples. But one example was Copenhagen, Denmark. We've been there. It is a place where bikes are everywhere. Everybody bikes to work. It's about almost 40% of the population bikes to work. All right, so what happens? I just assumed the Danes were just superior people and like to exercise more than I do or something. But actually what they did, it was within the last 20 years that this kind of happened. Within 10 years, they tripled the number of people riding bikes. What they did, they went out and asked people, like, why won't you ride your bikes? What's going on here? And so some people are enthusiasts, they love it, but most of us are afraid of getting hit by a car. And they didn't want to wear bike helmets and fancy outfits. They just wanted to get on a bike and ride to work. So what they did was they ended up putting the street, then the parked cars, then the bike lane. And so because it's inside the parked cars, there's this buffer, this safety zone. Excuse me. So that really helped make it what the community, what people wanted. So that's the idea-driven change. This is very short. Oh, that came right up, right?
You see that capitalize on all the new thinking about how we can reorganize cities. That will function completely differently to everything we think and know about cities. So that prospect of dramatic, disruptive change within one generation, I mean, to be able to get that, like we're in the middle, on the cusp of this unbelievably dramatic set of forces coming together. Fundamentally, as a species, we need things that can power our imaginations, that can get our passions going, that can, sort of give us a sense of meaning. And that is not a brick, it is not a pipe, it is an idea. That's what drives cities forward.
So I love that clip. It's not a brick, it's not a pipe. It's an idea. It's our passions. It's our energy that is going to make the future what we want it to be. So vision for change. So at Kent, distance learning is part of that vision, but it's only a part. It's only, in some ways, a small part. But as far as the distance learning, what we want to do is establish Kent State as a leader in quality online learning, right? So a lot of times with online learning, quantity is the focus. And whether you're doing that, how many students you have, how many courses we have, that kind of thing. But what is the quality of that experience? And to get to that goal of being a leader in quality online experience, what we deal with is constant change. How do you lead in a changing environment? So this flag in the sand is a reference to a talk I saw Jared Spool gave one time. He's a researcher. He went out to all these very successful entrepreneurial companies. And he's like, why? You know, how do you guys do this? Your whole environment's changing constantly. How are you successful? How do you actually lead and give people an idea of what they're supposed to be doing, where they're supposed to be going? And what he came away with is they all had a very similar philosophy of a flag in the sand. And the flag in the sand is the idea that you do have to have a vision. You do have to have a goal of where you're going. And you have to put that flag out there, and everybody in your company has to be able to see that flag. And we're all going to head to that flag together. We're heading in that direction. But everybody knows the flag's in sand. And that flag is going to move. But that's okay. It doesn't mean you've made a mistake. Doesn't mean you went in the wrong direction. It just means you're shifting now to where that flag is. But we're all going in the same direction, and we all see that flag. So that was his analysis. And I do feel, I say this a lot to the people that work on our team. Because sometimes they feel like, you just, what? We were just going to do this. Now we're doing this. But that is what part of life is. And having that kind of metaphor actually helps, because we do see like, hey, this is where we're headed. We're headed toward that quality online learning experience. It's not always that we're going to keep the same process, the same procedure. We're going to come up with those, but those may change, right? We have to be ready to have that happen. The other thing you have to do is identify, well, what do we mean by quality? If that's our goal, what are we talking about? In quality with online education, we really stop thinking about just courses. The students we get tend to be non-traditional, and they have different expectations, higher expectations, really, to be frank. And the quality of the interaction starts really early on. From the minute they see the first Kent State website to the minute they make a call to somebody to find out more information, every one of those touch points is really important. It's got to be a quality experience. They've got to get some satisfaction and feel like they're being brought in the right direction. So everything from application registrar, all of these things are very siloed because we're a huge university and everybody has their thing that they're in charge of. So bringing those things together so they flow, incredibly important. You know, I'm mainly involved with this teaching and learning, trying to get the courses, and we really try to talk in terms of whole programs and readdressing the entire construction, the curriculum of those programs, making sure one course flows from one to another. And that inside those courses, it's very clear and things are, students aren't confused when they get there, and that they have a really great experience, that they feel like they know. One of the things we know is students want to know their instructor, right? They don't want that distance. They want to feel connected, so you have to find a way to do that. And then continuing on with what does this mean? Am I going to feel fulfilled? Am I going to get a job? Am I going to advance in my career? What do our alumni say and feel about Kent State? You know, what is the essence of Kent State? So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but this is the type of thing that we work with a lot and thinking through, like, what does it mean to have a quality course? The big thing that we try to do is instill the idea of design. So early on, a lot of distance learning courses would be like, I lecture for an hour, and then I give students homework, so I'll do that online. So I'll record an hour lecture and give the students some homework, and they'll love it, which they don't. So nobody watches an hour video of somebody talking online, like nobody. I mean, even if you're really good at this, you still don't do that. So you had to really change the whole structure of what you're doing for that digital environment. And so we really talk about that. And the other thing is, there's so many things a teacher does when they're in a classroom that they don't even know they're doing. But the eye contact, the way they adjust, they can't do that online. So there are things about online that make it very difficult. Well, you have to spend a lot of time up front with organization, thinking through your instructions have to be incredibly clear, all those types of things. But also the other thing is, you have to design in those places where you're going to interact with the students, where you're going to be giving feedback, where they can interact with other students. And that's not easy. So it takes time, but it's incredibly important. That's the thing that all research is showing, doesn't matter if you're online, you want to be connected, right? You want to know each other. People are very social. And then the collaboration is just the idea of the environment really is different. When you had a face-to-face classroom or just preparing for this talk, I can kind of just go off and do it myself and then come and give this, although not entirely true. I had Andrew and I had a lot of people actually help set this up for me. But in an online classroom, you have to have that technical help, maybe the design help, but even more than that, you don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. Digital means it didn't go away. It's still sitting there. So if somebody does something really fantastic, you can use either that whole piece, sometimes we call them learning assets, or just bits and parts of it. And so that's a whole different way of thinking. Like, why keep reinventing the wheel? We can actually keep building on what somebody else has done and bring all that together in a course. So that's kind of an exciting area, but also intimidating and different for people. So that's one of the areas where we really have to think about it. And of course, you should really start looking at, I'm going to make sure I don't go too long here, quality standards. We use something called Quality Matters. Actually, Shelley was involved with that. I think you may be one of the first people that brought it to Kent State. And then we also, so we use that to help design classes. We use it as a basis, and then sometimes some courses and programs get credentialed by that. But we also have, accessibility is huge. So when you're thinking about online, one of the really great things about it is access. Not everybody can come to your campus. And what we also find is a lot of people with disabilities, this may be an opportunity for them to get an education where they couldn't before. We're even starting to see, and this is very early research, but the idea of sometimes students from poorer districts or minorities who haven't had the opportunity to be in a lab, it's often very intimidating to actually go to a physical lab. But doing an online lab first, a lab online, you can actually get the idea of what this is like before you, and then next time maybe you're not afraid to go to a physical lab and participate in that. So there's a lot of things around accessibility. Actually, for whatever reason, Ohio has become the center of lawsuits for accessibility too. So it's kind of front and center in our mind of we need to make all our content on our courses accessible for hearing impaired, sight impaired, and so forth. So we're really interested in that. And then also our own online framework of we do the design to teach kind of idea. Make sure that we've got the instructional design up front so that we can really have those teaching interactions. The other thing about design, I'll say, is that we often think about online as, hey, this is an online course, this is exactly what it let's spend a lot of money, make that one course, and then we're good to go. That's not how teaching works, that's not how courses go, whether they're online or not. There is more expense to making an online course to begin with. That's a fact of life, but it doesn't mean it should be static. It has to be dynamic. As soon as teachers teach, they know some things that they want to change and tweak. So we have to have an iterative process, and that's kind of a learning experience I went through of our team trying to say, hey, you've got to get all these things done, it's got to be perfect. It doesn't, it never is. And so you just have to build in the idea of let's get those feedback loops and let's keep improving as we go. This is one more video, but I think we're running fairly short of time. I want to leave some time for question and answers. So I'm going to skip that one. It was just another promo of all these things we do that are great. And I'll just finish up with, we've got a couple of websites that you can look at. The online degrees is basically our student-facing. These are all the degrees that we have online. A lot of those degrees are fairly small. And then we have probably not quite 10 that are fairly substantial size programs. A lot of those are certificates too and that kind of thing. But our online teaching, even though that's geared toward faculty, you might find that very interesting. We have a lot of information there. We talk about our design process and so forth. Anyway, that's it. I'm Val Kelly. I've got my email up there. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody wants to contact me. I'm opening it up for questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to comment on or have a question about? Go ahead.
How are companies accepting these degrees if they're online? Do they feel like the quality yet, or is it still analog?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of progress with, so the question was, are companies accepting online degrees? Early on, it definitely had a stigma. I think we're seeing the stigma go away. At Kent State, nobody actually even knows if you took an online degree or not because our online classes don't show up differently on your transcript. But some of the for-profits actually did give a bad reputation for online learning in a lot of ways. They tended to take advantage of the same people that in some ways they were giving access, but they also took advantage of people that really couldn't get through their courses. And so over time, we have to change the perception. I think the perception is changing tremendously, but it is something that just takes time. And like I said, just like in a face-to-face class, there's a lot of variety in the quality. Some are much better than others, and the experience that you take away from that can really change. But we do see a lot more acceptance. I think newer industries, you especially see it in the computer science and programming and that kind of thing. It's hard to even get some of those students to go all the way through college because they do learn, they watch each other. In fact, if you're futurists are people that look for trends and then they don't really make predictions, but they say, these are the things we think are going to happen. Some of the things, like if you watch the programmers, people that are learning coding, traditional university is very hard for them. They're in big demand, so it's hard for them to take 4 years off and do this because they could be working and making lots of money. And two, it changes so fast that they kind of tend to watch. It's almost like an apprenticeship. They need to watch people doing it. So you can kind of see that happening, and that really happens online. There are all kinds of places where you can go watch coders code and learn how they're doing it and have them walk through it. So. Yeah, so I think the acceptance is growing, but I think depending on what company you're talking to, there's still some resistance. Any other questions? Yeah.
In one of the slides, the city, you said they built buildings far apart, and
right.
found out that people really want community. And I saw that parallel with students who are taking online classes.
Excellent.
How do you, what kinds of things do you put in place, or are you trying to put in place to, typing back and forth is different than sitting in a room
right.
and engaging in conversation. How are you working to overcome that?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question and great connection. Thanks. Yeah, so online students really they've done a lot of research. They crave attention from faculty. And I think faculty oftentimes need that feedback from students too. And we also try to enhance the student-to-student interaction because that happens on a campus too. So some of it is within the design of the course to make sure that it's the actual feedback, that you're getting feedback. You can do that by text. You can do that by video. You can have live video sessions where you're actually communicating to each other. You can have your office hours where students are doing the WebEx or whatever and actually seeing you and hearing you. So there's all kinds of things that you can do like that. Dave actually runs the UXD program, and they have monthly, they bring in guest speakers, and everybody logs in and also sees and hears and can ask through audio questions and that type of thing. They also do a lot of connections with industry, getting people jobs, so there's constant back and forth on, hey, this job posting is out there. We do have, we just recently made a student orientation, and it's kind of going through all different levels of the colleges and universities to find out how do you want to use this best. That would actually get students acclimated early on and maybe getting to know each other. What we'd really like to have and should have sometime in the near future is a virtual campus. So if a football game is going on, they can watch it streaming. They can do those kinds of things too, right? So we don't really have that yet, but that would be a goal that we're aiming for, is to have that virtual community that's ongoing, that doesn't have to do with just your class, but the other activities that are going on, something like this. Yeah.
Locally and on kind of a, I guess, breaking it down on a level below the college and university level, but one of the challenges that exists in the online learning at the high school level is sometimes parents are turning to online learning as an answer when students aren't, when they're having social challenges in the school, whether it's a response to a bullying problem, where they're saying, my son or daughter isn't acclimated socially to the school, so they're saying, we want my child to learn at home, and we're going to turn to the online learning. So these students then are not having the social interaction, and then we see it sometimes where the kids they don't have necessarily that communication skill because they're not
Right.
they're not around people all the time, and they're kind of reverting to living in this virtual texting or really not having an interaction. So when it comes time for a job interview, a school interview, some of those skills aren't necessarily there. So then turning to and moving into an online learning for college or university level, are they prepared at the same time to then interview for a job or to work in an environment that requires them to be around others?
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, and actually one that we struggle with, because on the one hand you can see that, well, there's a positive thing there for that high school student that's getting bullied.
Right.
They can get their education and they can get away from the bullying for a little bit. But in truth, we all have to work through difficult situations, and somebody's mean to us sometimes, and we do have to do that connection with people and be able to work our way through that. Kent is not real keen on, we've done a little bit, but fully online undergraduate degrees starting with the 18-year-olds. There is a lot of thinking around Kent that we do want to, as much as possible, to get those students sometimes to the campus. Again, sometimes you can control for those things, sometimes you can't, because if students really want something, you're probably going to do that at some point. Right now, though, the focus for most of our online has been the sweet spot with distance learning, to be perfectly honest, is adult learners. So people going for their master's degrees are fantastic at online because they're motivated, they know why they want to be there, and they have study skills already. Undergraduate is much more challenging. High school, I would think, even more challenging. I've never worked at that level because you do need to develop personality. You do need to learn to look somebody in the eye, that kind of thing. One trend that we see that's very, very popular and is very intriguing is kind of online with immersion, or experiential learning with online learning added into it. There's a college that was started brand new called the Minerva Project. Basically, it's a college without a campus, and first the students are in San Francisco, then they're in Hong Kong, then they're in Brasilia. I mean, so 4 years in 4 different cities. And while they're in the city, they're totally immersed in some sort of project or experience. And even though the professors sometimes are in the cities with them, their classes are online. So it's kind of an interesting. So that one of the real advantages with online classes too is the information's always there. So you can go back to it. You can kind of go at your own pace. It really does give a lot of advantages in that way. But to your point, that's a struggle. We do a lot of things, even in our orientation, to say to students, if you're doing this because you don't want to talk to anybody, that's not a good reason. And it's the wrong environment. Yep. Right. And actually, it is harder to hide out in an online class than in a big seminar class. You can sit in the back of a room in the seminar class. Online, you have to interact all the time. It's part of those courses. Sometimes it's text. But you constantly have to interact, and there's a lot of group activities and so forth. So, yeah, very good. Any other questions?
Where are the massive open online courses fit into this?
Right. So, does everybody know what these are called? MOOCs, massive open online courses. One of the things that MOOCs did, they were started out of really prestigious universities, Stanford, MIT, Pennsylvania University is a big one. So what they did was said, we can make education free. It'll be fantastic. We can bring education to the masses. So we have these brilliant professors lecturing. We're going to make these courses, and 10,000 students can take a course at the same time. And so this has been going on for quite a while. And I don't know if I have a talk about the Gantner hype cycle, because MOOCs follow that perfectly. They got super hyped. I mean, New York Times couldn't stop talking about MOOCs. For us, we didn't go in the MOOC direction. It's almost the opposite of what we're trying to do with our online courses, in that we're trying to have a lot of interaction between students and their instructor and students and students. MOOCs aren't that way. MOOCs are, yeah, we've got this brilliant person. They're giving you this great information. It's all here, but you're kind of just guiding yourself. There's some interaction with peers, but trying to guide yourself through that. The really fascinating thing that came out of MOOCs is that, guess who? Hardly anybody finishes the course. Lots of people sign up, but hardly anybody finishes. But the really fascinating thing is who actually does finish the course. it isn't the intended audience of people that don't have access to the information. It's people with master's degrees and PhDs, because this is something they can do. They're very good at this. And so, again, you're kind of still feeding the same population. So that was an unintended consequence of what they're doing, not where they were headed. But the idea is great. The idea that that's what the internet's about. Information can be out there. But it really did highlight the idea that in order to learn, teaching usually has to take place. Most of us aren't that great at just looking at content and I'll just take away and learn all the lessons from this. So they've been a mixed experience. They're still there. They're still growing. We watch MOOCs a lot. We may sometime incorporate some things in our courses. But as far as overall success, it's not really the Kent State population as far as adopting those. Any other questions? I think we're right about at time, but thank you. This is actually a lot of fun. So if you ever want to invite me back, the breakfast was great, and it's always fun to talk about this, and it's always fun to be able to think a little bit outside the box as far as what's the future bringing, how does this connect to all of us. So again, thanks a lot for having me.
Well, thank you, Val. It was a great discussion this morning and a fantastic presentation. And I think our challenge, our intent this year was to bring topics and speakers that would engage our audience and also get everyone talking and thinking about the future and about some things that impact us nationally, impact the region, and that impact us here in Ashtabula County. And so that we can view these topics, not only, sometimes we tend to see things just a little bit from our viewpoint of how does this impact us here, and just see things from the view of what's taking place here in Ashtabula County. But there are bigger issues out there that will come here and that are taking place and that we will feel and see down the road. And so we want to start having those conversations about the future. And I think today's topic was great because we're going to see a lot of change, and change is something that we need to start thinking about and embrace as well. And so those things continue to come, and it's not something to think about, in the immediate future of, kind of jump and make plans and we're going to do this right this moment. But the best change is, with a well thought out plan. So thank you all for supporting the series this year. And you're going to see some emails coming out with some questions saying, what do you want to hear about next year? And so we'll look forward to that. And thank you and have a great day.
Nice to meet you.